I, Gerald R. Ford, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute
that I will faithfully execute
the office of President of the United States
the office of President of the United States
and will, to the best of my ability,
to the best of my ability,
preserve, protect, and defend
preserve, protect, and defend
the Constitution of the United States.
the Constitution of the United States.
So help me God.
So help me God.
Congratulations, Mr. President.
With those words spoken by George Washington and each of his successors, Gerald Rudolph Ford today became the 38th President of the United States. And as he repeated the phrases after Chief Justice Burger, Mr. Ford's hand rested on a Bible owned by his son, a theology student, open to a passage of Proverbs. Trust in the Lord with all thine heart.
From CBS News headquarters in Washington, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. Truth is the glue which holds governments and civilizations together. President Ford said as he took office today that, and he pledged an administration of openness and candor. Our long national nightmare is over, Mr. Ford said. Our Constitution works. Our great republic is a government of laws and not of men.
And about 2 hours later, in the East Room, where Mr. Nixon had said goodbye to his staff, Gerald Ford was taking the presidential oath. He declared an end to the nightmare of Watergate.
I am acutely aware that you have not elected me as your president by your ballots. So I ask you to confirm me as your president with your prayers.
President Ford took office 2 hours after Richard Nixon departed from the White House, leaving behind a letter of resignation to be submitted while he was airborne for San Clemente. The unprecedented letter said simply, I hereby resign the office of President of the United States.
From CBS News headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. President Ford said today that in spite of Congress's limitations on the use of troops overseas, he believes he has the authority to call on the military to protect any evacuation of the 7,000 Americans in South Vietnam. And the president said he is ready to use that authority if necessary. Mr. Ford commented at a news conference in San Diego.
I have directed that money from a $2 million special foreign aid children's fund be made available to fly 2,000 South Vietnamese orphans to the United States as soon as possible. I have directed that C-5A aircraft and other aircraft especially equipped to care for these orphans during the flight be sent to Saigon. I expect these flights to begin within the next 36 to 48 hours. The unilateral military decision to withdraw created a chaotic situation in Vietnam that appears to have brought about tremendous disorganization.
Mr. Ford also defended the history of the American involvement in Vietnam.
I still believe that policy was right if the United States had carried it out as we promised to do at the time of the Paris Peace Accords, where we promised, with the signing of the Paris Peace Accords, that we would make military hardware available to the South Vietnamese government on a replacement one-for-one basis. Unfortunately, we did not carry out that promise.
That it seems apparent that for the first time in our nation's history, the enemy is about to win a war where Americans fought and died. Do you think that those 55,000 lives were wasted?
I don't think they were wasted, providing the United States had carried out the solemn commitments that were made in Paris at the time American fighting was stopped in South Vietnam. And I specifically warn any adversaries they should not, under any circumstances, feel that the tragedy of Vietnam is an indication that the American people have lost their will or their desire to stand up for freedom any place in the world.
This is Channel 2 News with Bill Curtis, Walter Jacobson, and the Channel 2 News team. John Coughlin with the weather, Johnny Morris on sports.
Good evening. Most of our newscast devoted to what happened in Springfield today. There was other news. In London, an explosion killed one man and narrowly missed Caroline Kennedy. And the kidnapping standoff continues in Ireland. But the attention of Illinois is now turned to what happened in Springfield today, or what didn't happen. Walter has that story from the state capitol.
Bill, after 9 hours of an extraordinarily dramatic day in Springfield, the House of Representatives voted not to override, I repeat, voted not to override Governor Walker's veto of the school funding bill. At least not yet. Mayor Daley and his forces from Chicago fell 3 votes short of overriding that veto, and then they decided to reconsider the whole business all over again in 11 days. The vote came after an all-day, very dramatic lobby effort. Bob Faw has that part of the story.
It was an impressive display of Chicago business, political, and civic muscle Mayor Daley led into Springfield this morning. School board members, bankers, county officials, and aldermen, and the mayor relishing the prospects of a good fight, predicting the House vote would be close, but that he would have enough support to override the governor's vetoes.
Well, I'm confident that the legislators will vote today on behalf of the school children of Illinois.
Throughout the morning, thousands of teachers, parents, and interested citizens streamed into the Capitol, many brought by busload after busload from Chicago.
The main event of the day, of course, was the address by Mayor Daley, one of the most dramatic addresses of his entire 20-year political career. You could hear a pin drop in this assembly hall when the mayor spoke. Here are some of the highlights.
The state constitution states where the responsibility belongs for financing a system of public education. It's been referred to time and time again. The debates in the Constitution of 1870 and 72, and again in 1970 and 69, reaffirms the principle that I hope all of us will ever be dedicated to, and that is the right every boy and girl in Illinois, whether it's on a farm or whether it's in the inner city or whether it's in the aristocracy and the suburbs, has a right to a decent education under decent conditions. So many people today, that word is no good. And you men said, I didn't say it, you men and women said, and rightly so, in 73, we should have full funding for the children of Illinois. Not for the kids in the ghetto of Chicago. Not for the kids any other place. We said all of Illinois. And that's why we're appealing to you today. And I don't think any legislative body or any man in public office closes his eyes to what's obvious to us. And what's obvious to all of us. And that is that we should be appropriating more money for retarded children. That we should be appropriating more money for handicapped children. We should be appropriating more money for mentally handicapped children. We should have educational opportunities regardless of where people live. As far as the legislation is concerned, I think I had something to say at the time that a late governor, former governor, proposed an income tax. And he couldn't pass it with his own membership. And the discussion which prompted the passage of that income tax for Illinois was based on the proposition that the schools would have full funding. And Ogilvy will tell you that, or anyone that's with them. And the people in this legislative body know that was committed at that time. And what do we see happening? Certainly he was defeated. He shouldn't have been. Because, let me finish. Because to his everlasting credit, he had enough guts and courage to do what was necessary at the time. And no one in politics that hasn't got that kind of courage shouldn't be holding public office. And as long as I'm around, I'll raise my voice for the school children of Illinois, and especially for the school kids of the inner cities of our state. And we can talk all we want about law and order and crime. But if a kid hasn't got a chance, and if a kid hasn't got an opportunity for a good education and a good home, we're kidding ourselves. We're spending millions and billions of dollars for prisons. Let's try to spend something for the kids of Illinois, for an education.
This is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather substituting for Walter Cronkite.
Good evening. Those involved in the fighting in Lebanon appear tonight to be giving peace a chance, but there's no telling how long that will last. Already the first units of an Arab peacekeeping force have arrived in the capital, and there are reports that Syria has agreed to pull back infantry forces from Beirut's airport and nearby hills. Syrian armored advances remain dug in 12 miles east of Beirut, outside the southern port of Sidon and near Tripoli in the north. But there are no reports of new fighting between the Syrians and Palestinian guerrillas and Lebanese leftists. We have a report from John Sheehan in Beirut.
For Lebanon, it's another chance at a political solution rather than an even bloodier war. The road to agreement on the mixed Arab peacekeeping force was paved by the Syrian invasion. But for Syria, even in purely military terms, it was a defeat. Syria intervened single-handedly and promised a quick end of the civil war. What the Syrians didn't count on was that their former allies, the Lebanese Muslim leftists and the Palestinians, would turn on them. In unfamiliar mountain terrain, the Syrian tank columns were at the mercy of the guerrillas. It soon became clear that there would be no quick, clean end to the civil war, and the Syrians found themselves mired down in a war of their own and rapidly losing faith. Syria first rejected the Arab League peace efforts, then decided it would be better to talk than to go on fighting and losing. The negotiations leave Syria in place on 3 routes. The mixed Arab force will join them and attempt to set up operations patterned on the United Nations peacekeeping forces between the Arabs and Israelis. The Syrian invasion pushed the Christian against Muslim civil war into the background. The Christians are lying low, and a major test will be whether they allow the mixed Arab force into their part of Beirut. Even with the new-style intervention, peace or war depends on very delicate negotiations among Christians, Muslims, and Palestinians. And there is still no force in position to separate them if the fighting starts again. John Sheehan, CBS News, Beirut.
The Communist government of South Vietnam now says it will hold war crimes trials for what it calls lackeys for U.S. imperialists and other enemies of the state. This is the first indication that there will be formal proceedings against those who opposed the communist takeover of the South 13 months ago. It is not yet clear when or how many persons will be tried or their possible punishment. Last February, in the final days of the Angolan Civil War, the eventual winners, the Soviet-backed Popular Movement, captured 13 foreign mercenaries fighting for the pro-Western side. Tomorrow, in the Angolan capital of Luanda, the 13, including 3 Americans, go on trial for their lives. The proceedings come 2 days after mass rallies demanding death for those on trial. John Lawrence reports.
This is where the trial will soon take place. It is under heavy guard. The 3 American and 10 British mercenaries, call them soldiers of fortune, ideological adventurers, or whatever, will be tried for their lives. It's the biggest public event since the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, the MPLA, celebrated its victory in last winter's bitter and brutal civil war. A war that brought foreign troops, first from South Africa, then Cuba, and finally a few hundred from Britain, America, and other Western countries. Of those who were not killed or managed to escape, 13 were captured on the losing side. They are the ones to go on trial. Daniel Gerhardt, a 34-year-old Vietnam veteran from Washington, D.C., is one of the soldiers who signed up with the pro-Western faction fighting in Angola. Gary Acker, 21, from Sacramento, is an ex-Marine who served aboard ship in the South China Sea during the Vietnam War as a corporal. Gus Grillo, 27, was born in Argentina but carries American citizenship. He, too, was a U.S. Marine who served in the Vietnam War. The chief government spokesman of Angola is Luis de Almeida, the Director General of Information.
We killed more than 150 people, for instance, in our country. And they violated the sovereignty of an independent country, and they came and they have been captured with weapons.
2 of the Americans who were captured are being given legal representation. Robert Sessner, an attorney from Ohio, and his assistant, William Wilson, have just recently arrived in Angola and met their clients.
I found them to be in good health. Apparently, during the time that they were there, they were not mistreated. They have been fed well. Their state of mind, I think, is good.
The short period of time that they were over there before their capture, it seemed unlikely that they had had time to become involved in substantial military activity in this country. And of course, interviews with the men have borne that out.
They were in a situation where they had not fired upon anyone and now are facing what we have determined to be the death penalty.
It is apparent in Angola that the defendants will be found guilty, but on what charges is not yet clear. John Lawrence, CBS News, Luanda.
President Ford's top economic advisor today predicted that the economy will grow by about 7% this year and that the unemployment rate probably will dip below 7% by year's end. In testimony before Congress's Joint Economic Committee, Alan Greenspan said the administration's mid-year economic review contains, quote, no major changes, but that the new figures are slightly better than January's forecast. Although there was no mention of a new figure for inflation, Greenspan said the underlying inflation rate has slowed to between 5 and 6%. Incidentally, General Motors has notified its dealers that prices on 77 model cars and trucks may rise an average 6%, about $300 a car. The Dow Jones Industrial Average climbed more than 6¼ points today. That's its biggest gain in almost 2 weeks. Volume on the New York Stock Exchange was 16,100,000 shares. The average price per share rose 26 cents on the New York Exchange, 3 cents on the American. On May 24th, the British and French Concordes began limited service at Dulles Airport near Washington. The major issue about these supersonic planes is their noise. A Federal Aviation Administration report, due for release tomorrow, details what has been learned about noise levels. Jim McManus has a preview of that report.
The FAA's noise monitoring program during the first 8 Concorde operations found the aircraft 2 to 3 times noisier on takeoff and ranging roughly even to 2 times as noisy on landing as subsonic jetliners, the variables depending upon pilot technique and weather conditions. In this 16-month trial period, FAA has 8 electronic monitors recording all Dulles flights 24 hours a day, 5 other manned sites where each Concorde landing and takeoff is monitored, and technicians employing computers to evaluate the data, measuring SST noise in the context of all Dulles operations. In this takeoff sequence, a Boeing 747 was measured at 91.5 on noise level instrument. And moments later, the Air France SST sent the needle to 123 in effective perceived noise level. Translated, that means Concorde was roughly 3 times noisier on takeoff than the relatively quiet jumbo jet. FAA also is surveying community response among Dulles Airport neighbors and will do the same at New York's JFK Airport if Concorde gets a tryout there also. The final decision could ban the SST or approve its service under a new regulation. Potential increased numbers of flights would bring another round of testing noise levels and community reaction. Federal approval would allow ongoing SST service at federally owned Dulles and leave it to other cities to decide for themselves if they too want the Concorde. Jim McManus, CBS News, Dulles International Airport.
For almost 3 months now, there's been an experiment in California to give carpoolers a break in the traffic as a reward for helping cut down on gasoline use. Harold Dow reports on how that experiment is going.
Here's Bill Keane in KNX Traffic and Weather Central.
The eastbound Santa Monica slow and go Overland Avenue to Arlington Avenue.
It's another day of high drama and low moans on the freeways of Los Angeles. And on the busiest of them all, the Santa Monica Freeway.
The diamond lanes are now back in effect. Of course, you got to have 3 or more, or you get pinched.
The Diamond Lane, among some Californians, a hotter topic than the primaries or Howard Hughes' will. An effort to encourage carpools and bus riding by reserving the fast lane for buses and cars carrying 3 or more during rush hours. Trouble is, that leaves one less lane for everybody else. And since mid-March, when the program started, they've been stewing behind the wheel.
I don't like it. It's too slow for one thing, and it really causes more of a congestion than what it was before.
And I think it's ridiculous. I'm really at this moment. It's really making me upset.
It's not working. It's not working? No, Lord. I have to leave home every morning about an hour and a half earlier.
State highway people watching from the sidelines figured that out of 250,000 vehicles traveling the Santa Monica Freeway each day, 4,000 are using the diamond lanes. And they concede many drivers have every right to squawk.
Many of these criticisms are valid. I think we're seeing improvement in these travel times. We had a difficult first week, especially with this job, but now we're getting travel times down to close to what they were prior to the job.
Some drivers are mad enough they've taken to picketing Jerry Brown's campaign headquarters, figuring California's governor should be straightening out the freeway instead of running for president. Brown has remained above the fray, but other politicians are bad-mouthing the Diamond Lane program at the drop of a fender.
Well, it's a flop. And it's a flop. It's ridiculous. And it's just taking a plan and ramming it down 100,000 motorists at least a day.
The highway people argue that unless something is done to break the one-person-to-a-car habit, parking surcharges or even gas rationing will be needed. So, despite the gripes, they're going ahead with plans to bring diamond lanes to at least one other Southern California freeway. Like it or not, diamonds are forever. Harold Dow, CBS News, Los Angeles.
In 1951, federal judge Irving Kaufman of New York sentenced to death Julius and Ethel Rosenberg for giving atomic bomb secrets to the Soviet Union. The Rosenbergs died in the electric chair 2 years later, despite many protests. The Rosenberg sons, known now as Michael and Robert Mirapol, today claimed that newly obtained FBI documents indicate Kaufman was guilty of judicial misconduct during that trial. They said the documents, quote, suggest that Kaufman maintained improper contacts with the FBI just before the sentencing and during the Rosenbergs' fight to stay the executions. And, the Sun said, the FBI papers indicate that Kaufman later tried to use the FBI to discourage critics of his conduct. Kaufman, now chief judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals in New York, declined comment, but the chairman of an ABA committee formed to defend Judge Kaufman called the allegations multiple hearsay. The Rosenberg Sun said an impartial group should investigate the questions they raised.
It's a little bit better day, America, since Mr. Coffee came along.
Mr. Coffee found the way to precisely control water temperature and brewing time so you get a better cup of coffee, America.
You make coffee better than coffee was, and it's only because Mr. Coffee came along.
There's only one Mr. Coffee.
This has been the CBS Evening News, with Dan Rather substituting for Walter Cronkite.